All right, good afternoon. If you've been to one of these events before, you know we're really sharp, getting started right on time and ending right on time. So you don't have to worry about your schedule this afternoon. We'll cut off the speakers right in mid-sentence if we have to. So welcome to this Mackinac Center event, Economic Freedom Across the World and in the States. So this is a fairly unique one. We do a lot of these every couple of weeks, typically while the legislature is here in session. So if you are in the Lansing area, you know your lawmakers or lawmaker staff, we encourage you to sign up for our events online. Often we do these that are kind of on an issue that the legislature might be working on, either at the time or later in the year. We've done energy policy and right to work and occupational licensing and criminal justice and things like that. This one's a little bit more unique because it's a broad issue. It obviously affects us here locally, but it's a worldwide issue on this concept of economic freedom. So we hope that you enjoy it here. If you don't know who the Mackinac Center is, we are a free market economic think tank. We have an office here in Lansing, this floor and the next floor up, and then our headquarters is up in Midland. But we regularly host events. We put out a variety of publications, research reports. We have a news website. We have a legal firm. So if you're interested in any of that, we encourage you to check out mackinac.org, sign up for those publications and stay informed, and especially sign up for these types of events. So today, economic freedom across the world and in the States. So governments determine levels of economic freedom through policies that encourage or restrict people in pursuing their interests. Taxes, regulations, the ease of trading, the legal system, immigration, the supply of money, all these things determine how economically free a country is or how economically unfree. There's a lot of different things that go into a successful society. Many of them correlate with how economically free citizens are. In other words, economic freedom is strongly correlated with how healthy, wealthy, and happy citizens tend to be. So we have a panel today to talk about that internationally as well as here in the United States. Our panelists are Barbara Combe and Dan Mitchell. Barbara is Vice President of the Austrian Central Bank, Director of the Austrian Economic Center, President of the Hayek Institute, and Professor of Austrian Economics at the University of Banja Gorica in Montenegro. She serves on supervisory boards for several institutions, including the Austrian Central Bank, Vienna Insurance Group, and the Vienna University of Economics and Business. She's considered the leading female libertarian in Europe, and she's also a frequent speaker on public policy issues, especially on deregulation, competition, the future of Europe, and Austrian economics. Dan Mitchell is a public policy economist in Washington, D.C. His major research interests include tax reform, international tax competition, the economic burden of government spending, and other fiscal policy issues. He was a senior fellow with the Cato Institute for 11 years and spent nearly 17 years as an economist at the Heritage Foundation. He has decades of experience authoring papers, writing editorials, working with the public policy community, and presenting the free market viewpoint to the newspaper, television, and radio media. His books include The Flat Tax, Freedom, Fairness, Jobs, and Growth, as well as Global Tax Revolution. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, Washington Post, New York Times, National Review, Villanova Law Review, and many other publications. So the way we're going to work today, we're going to do I'm going to do some panel questions from myself, and then you will have comment cards out on the table in front of you. So as you have questions that you think of as you go, write them down. We'll have people pick them up, and then for the last 20, 25 minutes, we'll take questions from the audience. Thank you. All right, thanks for both joining us. I know you've made quite a trip. Barbara a little bit more than Dan, but so first of all, what is economic freedom? What does this concept mean? How do you define that?
Well, you start out with individual freedom. That is, I think, a precondition for economic freedom. And then you go step by step, as you already mentioned. I mean, what the tax makers, what the legislature allows us And the ultimate thing is as free as possible, and as long as you do not harm other people. This is what Hayek says. I limit my freedom, my individual freedom there where I start hurting other people. And this is, I think, the classic definition where we should start at. And then we take it to the next step.
Dick?
The only thing I would add to that is that if you look at the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index or the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, they're largely similar. Fiscal policy, monetary policy, regulatory policy, trade policy, and then sort of this overall rule of law, property rights component. The way I like to think about it is the rule of law, property rights really is critical. That's like the foundation of a house. And the other four categories are like how your house looks. Is it a rundown, dirty house, or is it a well-built, clean house? So if you don't have good property rights rule of law, frankly, it doesn't matter how good your economic policy is because people aren't going to want to invest there, create jobs, build capital, the things that really determine long-run incomes and prosperity. So get the rule of law and property rights correct, and then ideally have low tax rates, a modest burden of government spending, not a lot of red tape or trade barriers, all the things that most of us are probably familiar with in terms of regular government policy.
Let me add something, since you mentioned property rights. Property rights are the cornerstone or the basic, actually, for capitalism, for functioning markets. And the places where property rights are not established or not treated well and not being put into practice, those places we call communist countries, or even more socialist countries, with a tendency from to. And I think it's a danger not to respect property rights and not to protect them. And I think this is a precondition for economic growth and well-being as well. And if government doesn't take care of individuals' property rights or companies' property rights, of entrepreneurial property rights, then I think we're on the way down.
And actually, let me throw in one other comment, because a lot of people think, oh, well, Sweden or Denmark, they're socialist. Not at all. They rank at the very top of the World Property Rights Index. Now, they have very bad, I'm a fiscal economist, so I'm normally criticizing them because they have high taxes and a high burden of spending. But they're more deregulated than we are. They're more pro-trade than we are. They have better property rights and rule of law than we have. So when you think of these economic measures ranking which nations are most free, it's sort of like getting a GPA in college. You might be flunking chemistry or getting a D, but if you have an A in every other class, your GPA is okay. On the other hand, if you're getting only one A or B and then you're flunking everything else, then you're getting a bad grade. And the example I used to use on that last example was Russia. For a while, until Putin changed it, Russia had a flat tax. I like that. I've written books on the flat tax. But did that make Russia an economically free country? Not at all. They had so many other bad policies. Their overall GPA, as you would call it, was very low. So it's getting decent or good grades across the board is really critical to have a pro-growth, functioning, prosperous economy.
Yeah, and that's a great transition to the question I had, which is, so you've named some of these, so overall tax rate, regulation rate, private property rights, trade. So is private property, is that really the one you really have to get right? And if you get that right, does that save you from being bad in some of these other areas? Do you have a way that where some things are more important than others, and which of those things are more important?
Well, as I said, I think the property rights rule of law is the foundation. Because if you don't have that, I used to use this example because I gave a speech in Paraguay years ago, and they had no functioning income tax. So that should have been a great place to invest. But the courts weren't honest, property rights weren't respected. International companies weren't flocking to Paraguay to take advantage of the absence of an income tax because other policies weren't being done right. Not to mention they had trade barriers.
I don't think Antarctica has an income tax. So
yeah, I'm probably not running there either. So yes, I think if there's first among equals, because in these indexes, they're all ranked the same. These 5 categories, 20% of each nation's grade. But I think if I was doing it, I would probably maybe have a double weight on property rights and rule of law.
And can you explain, well, so what is rule of law? Well, how does that work, and specifically what are countries that, how would you say that a country's doing it well, and what's countries that aren't doing well? What are they not doing?
Well, there is a difference between the Anglo-American countries and Europe because of the Roman law that we work with. But in Europe, it's how the courts function, how you can go and sue, and how you are protected from others or by the law. And these are the basic principles. And if this is working out, if you can rely on the rule, on the judges, on the judgment of, then you're safe. But there are places, as Dan already mentioned, where, on paper you have the rule of law, but, where courts are corrupt, where judges are corrupt, where you don't get your right that you deserve, and where, the law is not treated as in other countries. So that's a competitive advantage if you have this in place.
And to elaborate on that, rule of law doesn't mean having lots of laws and rules and regulations from government. It simply means that whatever laws exist are applied neutrally, as opposed to the rule of men or the rule of one man. If you're in Russia and Putin decides he wants your factory or your business, guess what? He's getting it. Same thing with Xi in China. Your property rights aren't protected. You have no confidence that the legal system's going to stand up for the little guy against the powerful state interests. So rule of law is not a term for having specific laws being passed. It's a term that's designed to say that it's not a system where arbitrary bureaucratic edict or dictatorial preferences are going to govern your policy.
Yeah, I remember reading, I think it was Antonin Scalia had made this point that the USSR had freedom of speech, they had freedom of press, they had these things, but they were parchment decrees. They were meaningless, and everyone knew they were meaningless, so they weren't actually a rule of law society. On the regulation side, even among conservatives that people I talk to, there's this assumption that, well, we have regulations because that's how we guarantee public health and safety, and so who would be against that? So what is the danger of having too many regulations? Why would we not want to have that if it's going to mean, obviously, a safer society?
Overregulation is the biggest danger, and not allowing the markets to work and as they should do.
The way I think of regulation, if you're going to have like a 100-yard race and you have a flat track with normal conditions, you're going to run as fast as you can and make it in your best time. But if all of a sudden on that 100-yard track, someone erects an obstacle course, instead of doing that 100 yards and, well, for an old guy like me, I count it in minutes, not seconds, but whatever my time would be, it would triple, quadruple, maybe 10 times as much, depending on how many obstacles I had to get around and get over. That's what regulation does. And there was actually a story that came out recently that I think summarizes it very well. According to the National Association of Home Builders, the average cost of a new house, about 25% of it, more than $90,000, is simply red tape. Now, to be fair, maybe some of that red tape is for things that would be good, that we would all want.
To protect the individual.
Now, normally, at least in traditional and small government and libertarian scholars have always said that's the role of the tort system. And I think, as a general rule, I would prefer the tort system rather than red tape and regulation. So I'm not going to claim, because I don't know, that all $90,000 plus of that red tape is completely harmful and unnecessary, but certainly, is it good for our society that a house is costing 1/3 more because of all this red tape? Who's that hurting most? Probably lower income families. It's contributing to housing shortages and things like that.
Plus, it's reducing the responsibility of the individual. And I think we should also go back to that good values that we are self-responsible, and we should make our own judgments and not want government to judge for us and tell us what is good for us or what is bad for us. I think if we build our houses, we all know what we want and what we need, and we don't have to be told by government.
Yeah, and I think you're getting at, everybody understands there's trade-offs in regulations versus actually being able to get something built and get something done. But the question is, how do we measure those, and can businesses and private society kind of measure those better than a government bureaucrat? So economic freedom around the world, is it getting better over time? Is it getting worse? Where are we at?
It was getting better, not because the developed world was getting better. The US, Western Europe, we maybe all peaked around 2000 in the industrialized world, and ever since then we've been going down. So Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, in general, the scores in the US have been going down, the same thing in Western Europe. Where we were seeing improvements was in the rest of the world. Developing countries were moving away from sort of the hardcore socialism and interventionism to better policy. But if you look at the most recent Heritage Index of Economic Freedom, which just came out in January, the world took a big drop. And the same thing last fall when the Fraser Institute's index came out. A lot of the coronavirus restrictions were accompanied not just by the lockdowns, but by new spending, new red tape, additional taxes. We certainly saw in Europe and the US accompanied by much worse monetary policy. So the last couple of years have been grim, but I hope that's just a short-term phenomenon. And as we sort of get past that period, maybe the scores will go up next year, at least I hope.
Well, hopefully for the US. I mean, the pendulum is always swinging back and forth, and we've seen that in Europe. In 2000, the pendulum with regards to more economic freedom, more liberalization, deregulation was really big when we privatized telecoms, when we privatized the grid, etc. So these were really good. And then when the financial crisis hit Europe, all of a sudden, a big wave of regulation came in and was started. And this big wave has not stopped, and we're doing more and more regulation, especially on the financial front and the monetary front. Plus, we keep mixing monetary policy with fiscal policy, and that's also, or at least, making the decisions on the same side. And this is definitely not good for a free and prosperous society.
Actually, let me say something about regulation I should have said before. I was debating one of my left-wing friends in Washington, and he was saying, look at the good effect of regulation. And he put a chart up. He had one of his PowerPoint presentations. He put a chart up showing how workplace fatalities ever since OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, ever since OSHA was created, look at that. Workplace fatalities are coming down, down, down. Well, I looked at the data, and guess what? The 40 years before OSHA, workplace fatalities were coming down at the same rate. So in other words, the real lesson, was not that OSHA made a difference, but that richer societies can afford more safety. Obviously, working in a coal mine 100 years ago was a lot more dangerous than working in a coal mine today, not to mention the fact that we have much more people working in services, which are going to be safer than working in manufacturing and agriculture. So OSHA, if you look at the long-run trend of workplace fatalities coming down, and you look where OSHA was created, you don't see any change in the slope of the line. So just on that basis alone, his whole contention obviously fell apart. Unfortunately, I didn't have that data when I was debating him, so all I could do was sort of smirk a little bit.
Yeah, well, for me, all my best arguments I remember hours later after my wife's done talking to me, so I totally understand. I'm sorry, Barbara, did you have something?
No, I actually wanted to add something. When we have external shocks, and we have had a couple of external shocks in the past 4 or 5 years, whether it's COVID, whether it's the aggression towards Ukraine, whether it's the lockdown and supply chain shock that we have seen, and now, of course, resulting in an inflation shock that was, of course, visible for at least the economists who look at the documents in the right way. So this is all a disguise of bringing in new regulation. And if we look at COVID especially, how many regulations have come up there, whether it was the wearing of masks just to protect the consumer and the individual, or whether it was the vaccination, and whether it was the home offices and all those things that actually harm businesses and enterprises.
Yeah, COVID is I try to go more than an hour without mentioning COVID in my everyday life, so I hate to bring it up.
Well, it harmed us.
Have you all heard of this thing, this COVID thing? Okay. So it's an interesting thing on this. this point. I think of it, where I had young kids that were in school at the time, and you had, okay, we're going to shut down schools, and especially in the beginning, people are worried about that. So, but you think about how that would have developed and how it did develop among private schools, which is that for the most part in that first month, they all kind of shut down, and then some opened and some didn't. You had a lot of this natural experimentation. That kind of seems to be the difference when we're talking almost about regulation here, where on the one hand you have some type of regulation where the government just says you can't do it, you're done, we're shutting down all parts of this, whereas the market response would have been a little bit more, all right, some people have different risk preferences than others, some people, they would keep their kid home, and they did keep their kid home and learning online for a long time because they had different risk preferences than someone sending in. I mean, is that kind of the idea of how regulation works? Like, how does the market sort out, because the market has regulation, but can you talk at that point, how does the market sort out regulation versus government regulation?
Well, market regulation, as you call it, simply the price system.
Yeah.
And things like insurance. Those are things that sort of govern. I mean, no company wants to poison its customers. But the mere fact that there might be a mistake that causes the poisoning of a customer, that's why they have insurance. And that's why, as I mentioned before, normally people on the free market side prefer the tort system as a way of governing that. Not a lot of red tape, which tends to not stop bad things from happening anyhow. So yes, the market in some sense is a form of voluntary private regulation, whereas government is a form of just edicts and mandates and requirements. And if you look at the evidence, I don't think you get better results. I think our common law system is better than the civil law, Roman law system that Barbara was talking about, because the common law evolved and developed almost as this form of private regulation.
That's right. Country-wise, just look at Sweden and compare it with other countries in Europe. Sweden was much more freer during this COVID, sorry to mention this term again, period, but it's a very good example of, if you do not lock down, if you do not shut schools, and if you let enterprises work and don't send people to their home offices, and the economic harm is more or less zero. Whereas in other European countries that underwent all those lockdowns and sending people home for 2 years plus, etc., this is a real bad situation there.
By the way, is it true that things like Home Depot were open, but you couldn't actually go into the aisle with the seeds or something like that?
In Michigan, yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's from Whitlow.
The paint department.
I didn't know that was an urban legend. It sounded so ridiculous.
Or the paint department.
Yeah, we need another 2-hour.
Okay, so we stop on that now.
Yeah. So during when one of the most regulated countries in the world on these indexes is Haiti, and I remember during the hurricane that hit Haiti, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. I think it was Hernando de Soto wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and he talked about they had immense regulation and housing regulations and building regulations and zoning regulations and all these rules about what you needed in order to build. And yet Haiti was far more devastated by that hurricane than other parts and other similar hurricanes that hit other countries. And that point kind of being that I think he had a line in there that having too much regulation is the same as having no regulation at all, because the building inspections were bought off. They couldn't possibly regulate every area of the country.
And by the way, the same thing happened in Turkey with that recent earthquake that devastated, I think, the southeast region of the country. They had all these building codes, but nobody paid attention to them.
Right.
Well, they were wiped off.
Right. All right, so let's bring this down from worldwide to the states. So do we measure economic freedom among the states? Do we see similar, here in the United States, do we see, or in Europe, do they measure it country by country there? And what are the actual effects? I mean, are we seeing more economic growth? Do we see it in population? What are the things that we see from more or less economic freedom?
In the U.S. specifically, the Fraser Institute publishes something called the Economic Freedom of North America, which looks at Mexican provinces, Canadian provinces, and U.S. states and ranks them. And the U.S. generally does better. Alberta is the best Canadian province. The northern Mexican states are the best of Mexico, but they're all below even the worst American state. There's also freedom in the 50 states, that does the same thing, and that's probably more granular. You can look at which state is ahead on occupational licensing, which state is ahead on controlling government spending, which one is ahead on tax policy. So both of them allow you to compare the different U.S. states in ways that is very enlightening, because obviously the easy thing is just look at which states have no state income tax, but it's more than that, because Washington State has no state income tax, but it also has some other bad policies, so it doesn't rank nearly as well as, let's say, South Dakota or Florida, which are usually up near the top.
So with regards to Europe, the indices you mentioned, Fraser Heritage and many others, they also look into the European countries and rank them, of course. And we have a saying, if you're a member of the European Union, there is this one-size-fits-all target and goal that comes out of Brussels, which we as people who believe in individual freedom and economic freedom don't like at all, because we need to have tax competition among those countries. We need to have competition for enterprises, for the best human resources, for the individuals. And Europe has always been most successful when economic entities were bigger than political ones. In other words, when competition was in place and it worked out. And if we look what is happening right now in Europe, the country with the most competition and the most direct democracy, Switzerland, is always ranking top if you look at the European ranks, because individuals vote with their feet literally and are directly involved, whether it's the tax rates, whether it's migrants that they allow into the country, whether it's the amount of holidays that they for themselves are voting, and many other, or minimum wage, etc., things like that. So countries that are most competitive, of course, in Europe is Switzerland, and this is ranking the best. And then other countries are looking, Great Britain, unfortunately, is going down the ranking at high speed, unfortunately, not because to my dismay, they have left the European Union. I'd rather have a voice of reason in the European Union with Great Britain, but they decided to leave. But they didn't do the right things. They could have set up, they could have been much more competitive and outmaneuver also the continent by doing the right policies, namely tax policies, healthcare policies, education, etc. All those things that we don't have in place at the continent. But unfortunately, Theresa May or neither Boris Johnson did those things, which Lady Thatcher, when she built London City 0.0 and created the big financial hub in Europe there, could have been possible. So in the end, it's competitiveness that actually makes that, and it's individual politicians who make those decisions. And if Macron, for example, these days in France, he finally outmaneuvered the parliament, and he rose the retirement age to 64, but he had faced huge protests over the past weeks. You might have seen that in TV, but these are facts. Countries in Eastern Europe long ago have already decided, first of all, to build the third pillar, and second, to raise the retirement age to more than 65 plus. And the Western European states are just lagging behind.
So, yeah, I'm interested in this, especially for Europe, but also for the U.S. here, where there's sometimes a generational thing. But for a long time, you had this kind of, it's capitalism versus communism. It's social. It's this big fight over the commanding heights of the economy, and it's the U.S. on one side, and the USSR on the other side, and that's kind of gone away. I mean, I think we pulled that one out. But that was more about, okay, is there kind of generally free market economies, and there's these other countries, many in Europe, where they owned they actually had the government ownership of major parts of the economy. And that's kind of gone away. A lot of those have gotten sold off, like you mentioned, and now it's moved on to these fights over regulation. But Barbara, do people in Europe kind of grasp that? Do they see it as a fight that way? Are Eastern Europeans still have this kind of memory of communism? And Dan, what do you see here in the U.S. between the generations of kind of understanding, I guess, the broadest points of that?
Well, it's more than 30 years that the Berlin Wall has fallen.
Yeah.
And the young generation was born in a free Europe back then. So those young kids, they don't remember very well, only by hearsay from their parents. But especially right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and when the Eastern European countries started to open up and to do structural reforms, they knew that they had to turn around 180 degrees away from communism, and they took the best practices. Mart Laar, for example, in Estonia, was somebody who immediately started with e-government back then, and now this country is one of the leading countries. They implemented private pension systems in many of those Eastern European states. They implemented flat tax. Even the socialist government in Bulgaria implemented a flat tax of 10%. Then other governments followed through, which, for example, when Slovakia implemented a flat tax of 21%. Austria back then had a corporate income tax of 35%. So, which is just, across the border. It's half an hour from Vienna to Bratislava. Companies fled Vienna or left Vienna in order to get registered in Bratislava for the corporate income tax rate. And then all of a sudden the Minister of Finance understood, I need to do something. And he brought down the corporate income tax rate to 25%. So all of a sudden his coffers were full and he had much higher revenue than before. And we had many more companies to register in Austria. So these were just little examples. Also with the education system in some countries, especially in the Balkans, where many private universities were allowed to outcompete the state system that we have in Western European countries. So all those little things helped a lot to make the Eastern countries freer and to help them grow. They had tremendous growth rates back then, 7, 8, 9, 10%. And then, they are getting integrated into this entire European system. And the biggest thing was actually the change. The biggest change was after, as I mentioned, the financial crisis, the big financial crisis, when it hit Europe, when all the sovereign debts that the Western states had built up became evident. And what was Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac for you in the US was a sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And it became evident, and then all of a sudden there was a big thing: how can we bail out those countries that have overspent, that have not responded to the Maastricht criteria over the years, and who just overspent. And then it was Greece, it was Spain, it was Portugal, it was Ireland, it was those countries that had to be bailed out. And then all of a sudden, a small country like Slovakia, with a much lower GDP per capita, had to pay dues to Brussels in order to pay for Greece, with a much higher GDP per capita. So these were imbalances that were seen all of a sudden, all between 2010, 2012. Then we started with the European Stability Mechanism, which is, the wealthy states pay into this and the other ones are being bailed out. It's a redistribution thing on the supranational level, actually. And there's only one country that really did the reforms, and this is Greece now, finally with a conservative government that underwent structural reforms, but only after 10 years. And now they are, currently they are having a surplus in their budget, but still lots of debt that they have to manage. But this one-size-fits-all thing in Europe is not a good thing. If we looked only at the 4 European freedoms, the freedom of movement of individuals, of labor, of capital and goods. That would be, I think, the ideal version that we need.
In terms of the United States, we
Sorry
don't
for
have the
being long.
fight of socialism versus capitalism. And let me just explain something very important. It sounds a little bit wonky, but it is relevant. Socialism technically is government ownership of the means of production. Collective farms, government-run factories, stuff like that. The UK made that mistake after World War II. We never made that mistake, and actually most of continental Europe didn't make that mistake. The battle in the United States is not, even Bernie Sanders, he probably privately believes in collective farms and things like that, but even he doesn't propose that. Our battle in the US is mostly about technically fascism, because it's private ownership but government control and direction. But let's just call it corporatism, because fascism has all sorts of other connotations. So this intervention, corporatism, cronyism, whatever you want to call it, is one threat in the US, and then the other threat is the entitlement state. And that's simply a function of changing demographics. We set up entitlement programs when we had a population pyramid. We probably all learned about that in school. Normally our society has a few old people, lots of workers, and an even bigger generation of children. Well, what's happening over time is that we're having fewer kids and we're living longer, so that population pyramid is becoming more like a population cylinder. And guess what? Entitlement programs set up decades and decades ago are now fundamentally unaffordable. So in my mind, our biggest challenge is, are we going to reform the entitlement programs in ways that preserve our current tax system? Not like I like our current tax system, but I don't want it to become a European tax system. Because if we don't reform the entitlements, guess what? There will be massive middle class and lower income tax increases. Here's the dirty little secret. The taxation of rich people in Europe isn't that much different than the taxation of rich people in the US. They have gone up to about the Laffer curve maximum of taxing rich people, just like we have. What's different between the US and Europe is they have value-added taxes that massively hit ordinary people. They have social insurance taxes that are much higher. They have energy taxes that are much higher. So you look at the giant difference with higher fiscal burdens in Europe, it's overwhelmingly financed not by rich people, but by middle class and lower income people. So when I see Joe Biden getting up on the State of the Union and saying, we can't touch Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, you know what he's saying? He's saying, in the future, we're going to massively tax ordinary people. And by the way, I'm not making a partisan point. Trump has also said, don't touch entitlements. And guess what? He is saying implicitly, just like Biden is saying implicitly, let's have massive middle class tax increases. So Republicans can be wrong on this issue, Democrats can be wrong on this issue, but rest assured, over the next 25 years, we're going to have a massive fight. If we don't reform entitlements, our children and grandchildren are going to have a much weaker European-style anemic economy than we have today. So as much as a lot of Republicans like to criticize Paul Ryan today, I hope the GOP goes back to his entitlement reforms that were in those budgets in the early 2010s, because that would have done a great service for the future of our country to reform those programs.
All right, so I'll do one more question while we do that. Go ahead and start passing your note card or your questions on, and we'll get to audience questions. Dan, you might have basically just answered this, but what is the biggest, maybe you can take it to worldwide, but what's the biggest worry on the backtracking on economic freedom, the part that you guys are each most worried about?
Well, I think the entitlement state, it's not just a problem in the US, it's also a problem in Europe, because their aging populations and falling birth rates are even worse than ours. And by the way, I don't want to say worse like it's good to live longer. Every time I get more gray hair, I like the idea that we're living longer. And of course, everyone should have as many children or no children if they want to. But when governments have set up these entitlement programs that are based on the presumption of they need lots of children, ever-growing number of children to make those things work financially, that's not happening. And of course, if you look at the European Union's aging report, I'm probably one of the few people in the US that actually looks at that document. There's this thing called
the reproduction rate.
The age dependency ratio, which shows how many workers are there going to be for every person relying on government. And those numbers are becoming astronomically bad in Europe. So they're already way down the path where they're already taxing the you-know-what out of middle class and poor people. They're already taxing the you-know-what out of rich people. I suspect that the Greek fiscal crisis that we saw about a dozen years ago, that's about to be repeated in Italy, and it's going to be repeated in other European countries because I don't see any political will to fix those things. And of course, I have worries that we don't have that political will in the US because you have major figures in both the Republican Party and Democratic Party that are saying, don't touch entitlements, which again, if you are saying that, you are saying you want massive tax increases. You can deny it, but the reality is you're saying you want massive tax increases. And I think that is reckless because I think at least the people on the Republican side know that's not a good idea privately. If they're not willing to defend good policy publicly, well, frankly, they're being unpatriotic.
What are you most worried about, Barbara?
The entitlement principle and the debts that we have built over the past couple of 15 years. If we just look at the central bank amounted to the TLTRO 3 and the EPI, the asset purchasing programs, this is 3,200 billion that we have built over the past 10 years, actually since 2012, which is an enormous amount of debt. Plus, we have added another 3,000,
Well, 3,000 billion is 3 trillion.
Trillion,
so
yeah,
just
3,000 trillion,
to
sorry.
American.
Trillion, just within this short period of time. And we are reducing it by 15 billion per month now. So it went up like that, and we're just reducing it. I don't know how long this will last. And then there will be another emergency program that will be created in order to bail out countries plus companies as well, like it happened during the lockdowns. And I think this is the biggest worry that I have, that people don't go back, or politicians don't go back to reason. And
Well, I've got 4 kids, so I'm doing what I can to
thank you,
take care of this
thank you.
retirement issue. I'll kind of combine, wasn't too hard on my part. So I'll kind of combine 2 here. So one asks, like, what specific entitlements are we talking about? And then combine with that, since we're on that, how soon until Social Security and Medicare get means tested?
There are 3 big entitlements in terms of the federal budget: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And Social Security actually is the least of the problems. All 3 of them have very straightforward solutions. With Medicaid, which is the government's health care program for poor people, you do what we did with welfare reform in the 1990s under Bill Clinton. You just block grant it. Very simple. With Medicare, which is the government's health care program for old people, I'll be eligible in 3 months. I realize you all probably thought I was 35, but I'm really older than that. But with Medicare, what you basically do, and this was in the Ryan budget, 10, 12 years ago, you turn it into a premium support system very similar to what federal employees have. And then you limit the growth of that annual premium support that you get. And with Social Security, again, that's not growing nearly as fast, but the solution there is to do what Sweden and Australia and I think 46 countries as of latest count have done, which is shift to personal retirement accounts. That doesn't save you money right away because you still have to pay off current retirees and older workers, but over 30 or 40 or 50 years, it creates a much better system for workers and a much better system for taxpayers. So we know what to do. And again, Republicans in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, they passed budgets in the House, and then in 2015 in the Senate, after they took over, they passed budgets that presumed Medicare and Medicaid reform. So they have done it. They have voted for it. And they didn't lose elections as a result. Remember, the left had these demagogic ads showing a Paul Ryan lookalike pushing a grandmother in a wheelchair off a cliff. They got reelected. So I think that the American people, if they're talked to like adults by honest, good people, pointing out the problems and the trade-offs that we have to make, I still think entitlement reform is possible. And again, Medicare and Medicaid is much more important to get them because that's driving like probably 80% of the long-run unfunded liabilities. One final quick comment. The trust funds for Social Security and Medicare, they're fictitious. I mean, they're there, but the only thing that's in them is IOUs. Yes. Well, if I sort of went into my kid's college fund and had a nice weekend in Las Vegas and wrote "I owe myself," and put it in my pocket, would I have a real asset? Of course not. I mean, it's simply the government saying, yes, you, the government, have the authority to tax people in the future to pay off this IOU. It's not a real asset. A real asset is when you have a 401k or an IRA with a financial services company. It's not when the government says, I owe myself money.
Just a little add-on with regards to Europe. Most of the Western European countries have 2/3 of their budget expenditure is on Social Security, healthcare, and pension. More than almost 2/3, and in some cases even more. So the maneuver possibilities for doing something real good, whether it's safety or whatever, there is nothing left. So that's where we are these days.
How important is a flat tax to economic freedom?
Super.
I love a flat tax, but it's all about the rate. Iceland used to have a flat tax at a 37% rate. Is that what I want? No. In France, under Hollande in 2013, there were more than 8,000 households that paid an effective tax rate of more than 100%. So 100% flat tax, is that a good idea? No. What we want are low
Well, those people moved to London.
Or a lot of them moved to Belgium. I mean, who would have thought Belgium would be a tax haven, but compared to France, it was. Well, actually, Belgium has no capital gains tax, so that's why a lot of French entrepreneurs move there. The flat tax, yes, we all like the idea of the postcard, a much simpler system, but really, economically, what's good about a flat tax is the low marginal tax rate, not the 37% of Iceland or the 100% of France, but a low marginal tax rate. No double taxation is saving and investing. Between the capital gains tax, the corporate income tax, the double tax on dividends, and the death tax, a single dollar of income can be taxed as many as 4 different times. And since every economic theory, I mean, even socialism, every economic theory agrees that you have to set aside some of today's income to finance tomorrow's growth. And yet that very act of saving and investing is where we have the highest effective tax rates in the United States. So no high rates, no double taxation, and no loopholes. Because why? We don't want the government to be doing industrial policy through the tax code. Bribing you through the tax code to make an inefficient choice is just as bad as that Joe Biden CHIPS legislation that is now being used to try to control what private companies are doing. So the flat tax is a great idea, but it's not the postcard, it's the low rate, the no double taxation, and the no loopholes. And frankly, if I had a choice, the 37% old Iceland flat tax or the Singapore system, which has a progressive tax rate schedule, but the highest rate is 22%, obviously I'm taking Singapore. So I like the flat tax, but what I really like is low rates, no double taxation, no loopholes.
So we didn't touch much on monetary policy. So we got a couple of questions on that. So how important is that for economic freedom? So the central banks, does that
we have a central banker right here.
There we go. So how important is it? Not very important, and we can move on, or how important?
Well, first of all, disclaimer: I'm only allowed to say certain things publicly. So sorry, because I'm still in office. But as I mentioned before, I think there's a precondition for sound money, and that's having central banking completely independent from politics. So there must be a line drawn between monetary policy and fiscal policy. In other words, no intervention from politics into central banks. Unfortunately, what we have seen on both sides of the continents, whether it was with the Fed or with the ECB, but with other parts as well, with other central banks as well, this has not worked out, especially after 2008 already. And having said that, there were many, many, many interventions. I just drew some numbers from before from Europe, but the US is not much better. And the next thing is, interest rates should be set definitely by the market, and the interventions that we have seen from the political side over the years with buying all the collaterals, etc., and creating all those programs have not done any good to us. We have seen situations that the can has been kicked down the road for a very long time, but eventually you will get the hot air out of the system again and reduce the balance sheets for the central banks. And this is not an easy task. It has to be done very carefully because we do not want to have bigger distortions on the markets. And having said that, I think this was, everybody can understand where I come from.
Can you say all the stuff that she's not allowed to say? Or
Well, I'll say two things that I think are very important. First, as much as I like the Fraser Institute's index and the Heritage Foundation's index, a lot of the measure of monetary policy is what is the explicit inflation rate.
Yeah.
Well, the high inflation that we suffered in 2022 in the United States was the result of bad monetary policy decisions in 2020 and 2021. That's when the Fed expanded its balance sheet by $4 trillion. That's when the European Central Bank expanded its balance sheet by about the same amount. That's when the Bank of England expanded theirs by about £1 trillion, which would be equivalent in terms of size of GDP. So the mistakes were made when the Fed and the other central banks were trying to flood the system with money. They panicked with the pandemic. Notice I didn't say the C word, I said pandemic. And that flooding the system with easy money, keeping interest rates artificially low, that's what actually caused the problems we had in 2022 with higher prices, and it's causing the problems that we're now seeing with the financial sector, because financial institutions, basically got accustomed to this world of never-ending, basically negative real interest rates. So bad monetary policy is a huge problem. It's not measured perfectly, though, by these indexes, and I think the authors would freely admit that. It's a very difficult thing to do. But yes, we are suffering today because the Fed made mistakes a couple of years ago.
Let me add one more thing. R-star, the natural interest rate in Europe, is still below zero. And it had a secular decline over the past 30 years, actually. And this was also one issue among the other things that you mentioned already. When the prices are imbalanced, then we hit inflation. As an addition, we had the so-called green economy. Well, we supported the green economies in Europe. It was mentioned both by von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, in 2018. It was announced, and then when Madame Lagarde came into office, she also said green monetary policy, which I think is not a mandate of a central bank at all. It's price stability and stability of the financial markets and nothing else. And so there was an impetus in addition to that. And with the time gap that we have seen that companies need time to implement all those new technologies, all of a sudden energy prices rose and rose and rose, plus then the lockdown, which distorted the price system at all. And then the third external shock with the war. Then all of a sudden you have a huge inflation, but we saw inflation already. The first sparks of inflation were visible in 2017 due to the bad policies at the beginning.
I'm fascinated by this next question. So we spent a lot of time and worry and talk about China here in the U.S. as a competitor. But this question is about India. So what can you tell us about India? Are they trending upward? Are they improving, declining in terms of economic freedom?
Like a lot of countries, there was this period between 1980 and 2000 called the Washington Consensus. And that was a period where even the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were basically on the right side because of appointees by people like Reagan, with help from Thatcher, of course. And during that last 20 years of the last century, a lot of developing countries moved dramatically in the right direction with privatization, deregulation, lower tax rates, all sorts of good policies. India is still not an economically free country. As a matter of fact, it's like one of the bottom 10 when you look at the trade variables. So they're really bad in terms of protectionism. I suspect that China is going to become less of a worry in the future, at least economically. Maybe there's geo-military concerns that I'm not competent to speak on, but economically, President Xi is moving China back in the wrong direction. China was terrible under Mao, one of the most awful, suppressed, repressed economies with per capita GDP of like $1,000, which is starvation level. That's why they had tens of millions of people dying there from starvation. Then under, what was it, Deng Xiaoping, was it?
Deng Xiaoping.
In the basically, I guess, late 70s, they started liberalizing. But when you start this low and you liberalize, you might still be way below a lot of other countries, and they still are way below a lot of countries, but the liberalization that they did, say that last again during that period of the Washington Consensus, they're now backsliding again. Xi is very big into industrial policy. He's very, obviously on COVID. If Sweden was the star pupil of the world in terms of not going overboard, China only recently has eased the lockdowns of their major cities. So Xi can't help, he has this dictator's control impulse where he wants to regulate and limit everything. The capital markets are completely cronyistic. You're not going to get loans unless you're the son or daughter of a Central Party committee member. It's a very unfree economy. So China basically entered the world trading system, took advantage of its status as a low-wage country to have a really big competitive pressure on the U.S., but now China is moving in the wrong direction, so I suspect we'll have to worry about them less and less over time. Now, maybe they'll invade Taiwan and do things like that that are an even bigger problem, but economically, they're hurting themselves, so I think we can breathe easier on that.
All right, last question. So what about moving to like a VAT tax, a consumer tax, taxation of everything at 20%? I know Europe obviously has a VAT tax. How do you feel about that, or as some people call it the fair tax here in the United States?
If you eliminate all other taxes, then 20% would still be too high. I'm a big believer in the 10th that was in the good old times, in the medieval times in Europe, that you had to pay to the emperor, which was even much 10%, but the 10th is...
10% was good enough for God, but not for government. So.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm totally with Dan, as low as can be. And we should constantly ask the question, what is the task of government? What does the government need the money for? How is it spending? Is it efficiently and effectively spent? And this is what we have totally forgotten over the times. We just add on instead of taking out things. And I'm a big fan of reducing the tasks of government as well.
Let me give a real quick answer because we have to get Barbara to the airport. We have to leave right away. Being a central banker, she probably has a private jet waiting for her or something.
I wish I had. No. No. And by the way, this is not in the central bank, this trip.
What do you think?
That's on the Austrian Economic Center and the Free Market Roadshow.
Up here? Come on.
There's a theoretical answer to the value-added tax, and there's a real-world answer to the value-added tax. The theoretical answer to a value-added tax is that it's basically as good as the flat tax. A flat tax taxes your income one time at one rate when you earn it. A VAT taxes your income one time at one rate when you spend it. Sounds good. And as Barbara said, if you could get rid of all income taxes and repeal the 16th Amendment and replace it with something so ironclad that even John Roberts couldn't rationalize that it was constitutional, yeah, put a VAT in instead of the income tax. But that will never happen. So the real world answer to the value-added tax is that politicians in Washington are salivating at the thought of having this giant new money source that enabled the massive expansion of the welfare state in Europe. You look at when the VATs came in the late 60s, early 70s, government wasn't that much bigger than it is in the US. They got that new source of revenue.
Went up.
The cost of the welfare state dramatically expanded. And as I just said earlier, if we don't reform entitlements, it's just a matter of time before politicians do taxes that hit the middle class and low-income people, and the VAT will be at the top of their list. They would love to get a value-added tax in Washington. Republicans aren't for it in theory because it's a tax increase. Democrats in theory aren't for it because it's a tax that hits the poor. But believe me, when push comes to shove, if we don't do entitlement reform, they're going to do a VAT. and then we're going to have that anemic European-style economic growth, and we're not all going to have private jets as central bankers when that happens.
All right.
You
well-
better take that back.
All right. Well, on that bright, cheery note, please help me thank our panel.
No wrong assumptions.
Yeah,
No
no,
wrong.
but Barbara, I don't think has a private jet at our disposal, so unfortunately, because she could drop me back off in Washington.
All right.
Exactly.
Thank you for attending today. So the next event the Mackinac Center will have will be our Evening with the Mackinac Center event. That's May 11th. That'll be in Rochester with Alex Epstein, who's an energy expert and future expert. He wrote the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and his other book that just came out, Fossil Future. So that'll be an evening event in Rochester. Check out our website if you're interested in that one. Please check out any of our publications out in the back if you're interested in some of our work. Sign up for things, and we'll see you next time.